I am Carmel, 32 years old, a senior compliance officer at Westfield Financial, with a finance degree from Cornell, and 8 years of dedicated service. My career was on an upward trajectory until my boss, Mr. Richardson, decided his unqualified son deserved my position. Little did he know that his nepotism would collide with the most important regulatory audit in company history, setting the stage for his own spectacular downfall. Before I tell you how I turned my boss's nepotism into his undoing, let me know where you are watching from, and hit that like button if you have ever dealt with workplace favoritism. Trust me, you will want to see how this unfolds. My journey at Westfield Financial began immediately after graduation. With my finance degree from Cornell University, I had multiple offers from Wall Street firms, but I chose Westfield because of their reputation for promoting based on merit rather than connections. At least that was what their recruiting brochure claimed. Westfield Financial is a mid-sized investment firm headquartered in downtown Chicago, managing over $11 billion in assets for both institutional clients and high-net-worth individuals. What many outside the industry do not realize is that in financial services, the compliance department is not just some back-office function. We are the guardians who ensure the company stays on the right side of increasingly complex regulations. One significant violation could result in millions in fines, loss of licenses, or even criminal charges for executives. We are not just paper pushers, we are the protective shield. Over my 8 years, I had worked my way up from compliance analyst to senior compliance officer, earning every promotion through diligence and exceptional attention to detail. My boss, Thomas Richardson, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, had initially been my champion. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s with silver hair and custom suits that screamed old money. He had the kind of confidence that came from decades of never being questioned. Jessica Martinez, my colleague and closest friend at work, often joked that Richardson liked me because I made him look good. "He takes credit for your work when talking to the executives, you know," she would say during our coffee breaks. Jessica was our compliance data specialist, brilliant with numbers and systems, and she never missed anything happening in the office. The trouble began about 6 months ago when Bradley Richardson, the boss's 24-year-old son, started appearing in the office. Bradley had apparently dropped out of his third attempt at college and now needed a career. He was the physical mirror of his father but lacked the experience or work ethic. What he did have was an entitled attitude and his father's last name. Patricia Winters, our HR manager, was a nervous woman who had been with the company for 20 years. She always spoke about corporate values and proper procedures, but somehow found ways to bend those same rules when executives made requests. I would later learn how deeply she feared confrontation with leadership. The most important figure, though one I rarely interacted with directly, was Edward Donovan, chairman of the board. A former regulator himself, Mr. Donovan had a reputation for being a stickler for rules and regulatory compliance. He had personally commended my work after I identified a pattern of potential trading violations that, if left unchecked, could have resulted in a $3 million fine. My report gave the company time to self-report and implement corrections, reducing the penalty to a manageable amount. That incident had led to Richardson promising me a promotion to Director of Compliance, a significant step up that would come with a corner office and substantial raise. I had even started looking at condos closer to downtown, anticipating the change in my financial situation. Then one evening, while working late to complete documentation for an upcoming audit, I overheard Richardson on the phone in his office. The door was partially open, and his voice carried more than he realized. "I need to make room for Bradley in compliance," he was saying. "The kid needs to start somewhere. He cannot do much damage, and compliance is mostly just checking boxes and filing reports." I froze, my hand still on the printer as I collected my documents. No, she is good at her job, but anyone can do that work with proper training," he continued, apparently responding to a question. "Bradley has my instincts. That is worth more than any degree." My stomach twisted. I had spent years building my reputation, staying late, working weekends during crucial periods, sacrificing my personal life for this career. And now my boss was talking about my position as if it was a training ground for his unqualified son. I considered confronting him immediately, but decided against it. Maybe I had misinterpreted. Maybe he meant to create a new position alongside mine. Maybe he simply did not understand what my job actually entailed. I needed more information before acting. But as I drove home that night, the knot in my stomach tightened. Something told me this was just the beginning of my problems. 2 weeks after overhearing that conversation, Richardson called me into his office for what I expected to be a discussion about my promotion. The quarterly executive meeting had just concluded, which was typically when such announcements were finalized. His spacious corner office overlooked the Chicago River, a view I had been looking forward to enjoying myself. As I sat across from his large mahogany desk, he gave me what I now recognize as a practiced look of regret. "Carmel, I wanted to discuss your promotion to director." He began straightening papers that did not need straightening. "The executive team has been reviewing our organizational structure, and we feel that the timing is not quite right for this move." "Not quite right," I echoed, my voice calm despite the sinking feeling in my chest. "May I ask what has changed since our last discussion?" "The quarterly compliance metrics are excellent, and we passed the internal audit with no significant findings." Richardson leaned back in his leather chair. "Nothing has changed with your performance, which remains satisfactory. This is about larger organizational restructuring. We want to ensure any promotions align with our long-term strategic vision." Satisfactory. After saving the company millions and working 60-hour weeks, my performance was merely satisfactory. "I understand," I said, though I did not. "Do you have a new timeline for when this restructuring might be completed?" "These things take time, Carmel. Perhaps by end of year, but I cannot make any promises." He glanced at his watch. "Was there anything else? I have a lunch meeting downtown." I left his office, with a professional smile plastered on my face, but internally alarm bells were ringing. This was not a postponement. This was the beginning of something else. My suspicions were confirmed the very next day when I spotted Bradley Richardson trailing the head of the trading department like a lost puppy. Over the following week, he appeared in various departments, always shadowing someone, always with the same bored expression, always checking his phone when he thought no one was looking. Jessica caught me watching him through the glass walls of our compliance department. "The golden child is making his rounds," she murmured. "Word is Daddy Dearest wants him to have management experience in all departments." "He has zero financial background," I replied. "He cannot possibly understand what we do." "Since when has competence been a requirement for management?" Jessica said with a bitter laugh. "Patricia from HR told me in confidence that they are creating a special position for him. Assistant Director of Special Projects or something equally vague." I wanted to dismiss it as office gossip, but my encounter with Bradley the following day made that impossible. I returned from lunch to find him sitting at my desk scrolling through confidential compliance files on my computer. "Excuse me," I said, struggling to keep my tone professional. "Those files contain sensitive information. You should not have access to my login credentials." Bradley looked up, not the least bit embarrassed. "Dad gave me the admin password. Said I need to learn all departments if I am going to move into leadership." He did not bother to get up from my chair. "These documents include confidential regulatory communications and sensitive client information," I explained. "There are strict protocols about access even for management." He rolled his eyes. "Look, Caramel, right?" "Carmel," I corrected. "Whatever. Dad says I need to learn the business from the ground up. Just pretend I am not here." I went directly to Richardson's office, where he dismissed my concerns with a wave of his hand. "Bradley needs to understand all aspects of the business," he said without looking up from his computer. "Compliance is a key department." "I understand that, sir, but there are regulatory requirements regarding access to certain systems and documents. We could be cited for violations if unauthorized personnel have access." That got his attention, but not in the way I hoped. He looked up sharply. "My son is not unauthorized personnel. He is being groomed for management. I expect you to facilitate his learning, not create obstacles." That afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with Patricia from HR, hoping she might intervene on the basis of company policy. She listened sympathetically in her small windowless office as I outlined my concerns. "I understand your frustration, Carmel," she said after I finished. "But Mr. Richardson has received approval from the executive level for Bradley's training program. My hands are tied." "Who specifically approved this?" I pressed, because I am certain Mr. Donovan would have concerns about the compliance implications. Patricia shifted uncomfortably. The approval came through proper channels. That is all I can say. As I left her office, my phone buzzed with a calendar invitation. The subject line sent a chill through me. Regulatory compliance audit preparation with external examiners. The date was just 6 weeks away, and the note specified that the audit would be particularly thorough this year due to new regulations. Under normal circumstances, I would have welcomed the challenge. Now, with Bradley being given inappropriate access and my authority being undermined, I had a sinking feeling that this audit could become a disaster. Not just for me, but for the entire company. The following week confirmed my worst fears as Richardson systematically excluded me from meetings I would normally lead. First, it was a compliance strategy session with the investment advisory team where my absence was explained as an oversight in the calendar invitations. Then the weekly risk assessment meeting was rescheduled without my knowledge to a time when I had a standing appointment with our legal team. Bradley, however, was present at all of these meetings despite his complete lack of regulatory knowledge. Jessica, who attended the risk assessment meeting, told me afterward that he had spent most of the time texting under the table while occasionally nodding as if deeply engaged. The worst part, she said as we grabbed coffee in the break room, was when Richardson asked him to share his thoughts on our KYC procedures. KYC, or Know Your Client, was a fundamental compliance requirement for financial institutions to prevent fraud and money laundering. What did he say? I asked, already dreading the answer. He said, and I quote, "I think we do a great job getting to know our clients. Really top-notch stuff." That was his entire contribution. I would have laughed if the situation were not so serious. The upcoming audit would specifically focus on our KYC protocols, which I had spent months refining and documenting. Later that week, I discovered Bradley was scheduled to present my quarterly compliance review to the executive team. This presentation included complex regulatory changes that had taken me weeks to analyze and simplify for management consumption. When I questioned Richardson about this, his response was blunt. "Bradley needs public speaking experience with leadership. Your slides are already prepared, so he will deliver them. You can sit in to answer any technical questions." The presentation was a disaster. Bradley stumbled through slides he clearly did not understand, mispronouncing regulatory terms and skipping over critical compliance risks I had highlighted. When questions came, he looked to me with panicked eyes, and I was forced to salvage the situation while he took credit for our team's work. The office dynamics began to shift as well. Colleagues who used to come directly to me with compliance questions started copying Bradley on emails or going to him first. It was subtle at first, then increasingly obvious as people sensed which way the wind was blowing. Office politics at its most basic: align yourself with the rising star, not the falling one. What truly alarmed me, however, was how Richardson began ignoring my documented concerns about actual compliance issues. I had identified several transactions in our high net worth division that showed patterns requiring enhanced due diligence under the new regulations. My email detailing these concerns received a one-line response noted but not a priority at this time. When I followed up with a more strongly worded memo citing specific regulatory requirements and potential penalties, Richardson called me into his office. "You need to be a team player here, Carmel," he said, my memo printed and slapped on his desk. "We cannot halt business operations every time a minor technical issue arises." "This is not minor," I insisted. "The new regulations specifically target exactly this type of transaction pattern. The penalties for non-compliance have doubled this year." He leaned forward. "The executive team has determined our risk tolerance on this matter. Your job is to document that we have procedures in place, not to disrupt revenue-generating activities." That was when I truly understood how dangerous the situation had become. Richardson was not just sidelining me professionally, he was potentially putting the entire firm at risk to protect his son's advancement and avoid rocking the boat. The following day, a company-wide meeting was called to discuss strategic leadership transitions. I sat stiffly in the back row as Richardson stood at the front beside our CEO, beaming with paternal pride, as he announced Bradley's new role as Associate Director of Strategic Compliance Initiatives. There was no mention of what this newly created title actually meant, but Richardson made multiple references to future leadership while putting his hand on his son's shoulder. After the meeting, Jessica forwarded me an email chain she had discovered while updating distribution lists in our system. Bradley had been added to the Executive Compliance Committee, a role typically reserved for director-level employees with significant regulatory experience. Worse, he had been given approval authority for certain compliance procedures, effectively allowing him to override my decisions. My confrontation with Bradley came unexpectedly in the break room the next day. I was pouring coffee when he entered with two traders from the derivatives desk, laughing loudly about someone's weekend party. So anyway, Bradley was saying Dad thinks I should get broad exposure before settling into my permanent role. Says compliance is the perfect place since it intersects with everything but is not too technically demanding. One of the traders noticed me and cleared his throat in warning, but Bradley continued obliviously. The current team is too conservative anyway. Dad says we need to streamline all the bureaucratic red tape that slows down business. Once I take over fully, we will implement a more business-friendly approach. He turned and finally noticed me standing there, coffee pot frozen midair. For a moment, he looked embarrassed. Then his expression shifted to defiance. Just telling it like it is, he said with a shrug, before leading his new friends out of the break room. That weekend was one of the worst I had experienced since starting at Westfield. I barely slept, my mind racing through scenarios, each worse than the last. I would lose my job. The company would fail the audit. My professional reputation would be destroyed when compliance failures were discovered. I would be seen as complicit if I remained silent. I would be seen as a troublemaker if I spoke up. By Sunday night, after pacing my apartment and ignoring calls from friends, I made a decision. I would not go down without a fight, but I would need to be strategic. This was not just about my job anymore. It was about professional integrity and potentially protecting the company from serious regulatory consequences. I opened my laptop and began methodically documenting everything that had occurred, every decision overridden, every concern dismissed, every inappropriate access granted. If I was going to fight back, I needed ammunition, and in the corporate world, documentation was the most powerful weapon available. The following Wednesday, Richardson summoned me to his office for what he described as a performance alignment meeting. I arrived with my notebook and a calm demeanor that belied my racing heart. Bradley was already there, lounging in one of the visitor chairs as if he owned the place. "Carmel, have a seat," Richardson gestured to the remaining chair. I wanted to discuss some changes to the compliance department structure in preparation for the upcoming audit. I sat down, noting that Bradley did not even bother to look up from his phone. "I have been preparing extensively for the audit," I said. "My team has compiled all the necessary documentation and updated our procedures to address the new regulatory requirements." Richardson nodded dismissively. "Yes, and that groundwork will be useful. However, we have decided to take a different approach to leadership during this critical period." My stomach tightened. "Different approach." "Bradley will be co-leading the compliance effort with you," Richardson announced, as if bestowing a great honor. "His fresh perspective, combined with your technical knowledge, will present a more dynamic face to the regulators." "Co-leading," I echoed, struggling to maintain my professional tone. "Mr. Richardson, with all due respect, the regulatory audit requires deep technical knowledge of compliance frameworks and historical context of our procedures. Bradley has been with the company for less than 2 months and has no compliance background." Bradley finally looked up from his phone, smirking. "Dad has been catching me up. Besides, these auditors are just ticking boxes. We need to manage them, not bore them with technical details." I turned back to Richardson. "Managing a regulatory audit is not about personalities. It is about demonstrating rigorous compliance with specific regulations through documented procedures and evidence of implementation. The auditors will expect detailed explanations of our risk assessment methodologies and control systems." Richardson waved his hand dismissively. "Bradley will handle the relationship aspects, the meetings, the introductions. You will support with the technical documentation as needed, but in a reduced capacity." Reduced capacity, I felt a cold wave wash over me. "Are you demoting me?" "Consider it a reallocation of responsibilities," Richardson said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Your salary will remain the same for now, though your year-end bonus will naturally reflect your reduced scope." I sat in stunned silence for a moment. This was not just about the audit or even just about Bradley. This was the beginning of my systematic removal. May I ask why I finally managed? My performance reviews have been exemplary. I have consistently identified and mitigated compliance risks that saved the company from significant penalties. That was when Richardson delivered the line that would forever change my approach to corporate politics. Leaning forward with a condescending smile, he said, "Your diploma is not essential, sweetheart. My son is taking over. Your technical knowledge is useful, but leadership requires a certain natural authority that comes with the right background." Bradley had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, but remained silent as his father continued. "We will transition your client relationships and key responsibilities to Bradley over the next month. You will report to him effective immediately and support his leadership of the audit process." I maintained my composure through sheer force of will. "And if I object to this arrangement," Richardson's smile disappeared. "Then we would need to discuss separation terms. But I would not recommend that path, Carmel. Job markets are tough, and leaving just before a major audit could raise questions about your performance." The threat was clear. Accept demotion and humiliation or be fired under circumstances that would damage my professional reputation. "I see," I said, my voice steady despite the rage and hurt building inside me. "Is there anything else for now?" "Bradley will email you the revised organizational chart and your new responsibilities. Make sure your audit documentation is ready for his review by Friday." I left the office with my head high, walked calmly to the restroom, locked myself in a stall, and finally let the tears come. I was not crying just from anger or frustration, but from a deep sense of betrayal and injustice. 8 years of dedication reduced to not essential because I lacked the right last name. A soft knock on the stall door interrupted my breakdown. "Carmel, it is Jessica. Are you okay?" I wiped my eyes and opened the door to find my friend standing there with a concerned expression. "Richardson?" she asked simply. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "Come on," she said, handing me a tissue. "Let us go get coffee across the street. You need to get out of this building for a bit." At the coffee shop, safely away from corporate ears, I told Jessica everything. The demotion, the thinly veiled threat, the dismissal of my qualifications. "That smug, nepotistic dinosaur," Jessica fumed. "You know this is not the first time he has done this, right?" "What do you mean?" "Before you joined, there was a guy named Robert in trading who was pushed out when Richardson wanted to bring in his golf buddy's son. Then in marketing, Lisa was sidelined when Richardson decided his niece needed a job after college. He has a pattern." "And no one ever challenges him?" I asked. Jessica shrugged. "People need their jobs. And he is smart about it, always finding some business justification, never making it obvious to the higher-ups what he is doing." When I returned to my desk, I discovered something that turned my sadness to alarm. Bradley had been given administrative access to our core compliance systems, including the restricted modules containing confidential regulatory communications and audit histories. This was more than inappropriate. It was potentially a serious violation of our regulatory obligations regarding information security and access controls. Worse still, I found evidence that someone using his login had already modified several compliance risk assessments, downgrading their severity from high to moderate without any documented justification. These were exactly the types of changes that would raise red flags with auditors. I realized then that this was not just about my career anymore. Richardson and his son were making changes that could expose the company to significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage. Whether from malice or ignorance, they were creating a compliance disaster that would be discovered during the upcoming audit. That evening, as I sat in my apartment, surrounded by compliance manuals and regulatory guidelines, I made my decision. I would not quit. I would not go quietly. I would fight back not just for my position, but because it was the right thing to do for the company and our clients. But I would need to be smarter and more strategic than Richardson expected. The realization that I needed to fight back strategically rather than emotionally changed everything. That night, I pulled out my copy of the Westfield Financial Employee Handbook and bylaws documents most employees never bothered to read thoroughly. I combed through every section related to reporting structures, compliance responsibilities, and most importantly, the company's legal obligations to regulators. What I found gave me hope. According to company policy, any changes to compliance leadership or procedures required documented approval from the board's risk committee, not just executive management. Further, the company bylaws specifically stated that the head of compliance must have relevant regulatory experience and appropriate industry certifications to satisfy our regulatory obligations. Bradley had neither. His appointment, while perhaps technically to a newly created position rather than my exact role, still violated company governance requirements. I also discovered something else interesting. Westfield had a rarely used whistleblower policy that protected employees who reported potential regulatory violations from retaliation. The policy specified that such reports could be made directly to the board of directors if the employee reasonably believed management was involved in the potential violation. Armed with this knowledge, I began methodically building my case. First, I needed comprehensive documentation of everything that had occurred and the potential regulatory impacts. I created a secure, encrypted folder on my personal computer and began transferring copies of relevant emails, system logs showing inappropriate access, and records of compliance changes made without proper review. I reached out to Amanda, a former colleague who now worked at one of the regulatory agencies. Without revealing specifics that would violate confidentiality, I asked general questions about the upcoming audit focus areas. They are particularly concerned with governance and oversight this year, she told me over coffee on Saturday morning. Too many firms have been creating compliance departments that look good on paper but have no actual authority or expertise. They will be digging into who really makes compliance decisions and whether they have appropriate qualifications. This confirmed my suspicions that Bradley's appointment would raise serious red flags if discovered during the audit, potentially triggering a more invasive investigation. Back at work on Monday, I began implementing my plan. First, I sent a detailed email to the entire compliance team outlining the specific requirements for the upcoming audit, with particular emphasis on documentation standards and access controls. I copied Richardson and Bradley as well as the General Counsel. As part of our audit preparation, I wrote, all compliance personnel should review the attached regulatory guidelines regarding required qualifications and experience for those with compliance oversight responsibilities. Please ensure all team members can demonstrate they meet these requirements, as auditors will likely request this information. It was a warning shot across the bow, subtle enough to appear as standard preparation guidance, but clear enough that anyone familiar with the regulations would understand the implication. Bradley was not qualified under regulatory standards. Next, I began systematically documenting every instance where proper compliance procedures were bypassed or undermined. When Bradley downgraded a risk assessment without justification, I sent an email requesting the supporting analysis and regulatory basis for the change. When he skipped mandatory compliance reviews of new marketing materials, I documented the violation and sent reminder emails copying the relevant department heads. Each of these emails was professional, never accusatory, and always framed as helpful guidance rather than criticism. I was creating a paper trail that would be difficult to dismiss as mere office politics. I also began securing copies of all critical compliance documentation off-site. Each evening, I backed up key regulatory correspondence and audit materials to encrypted storage, ensuring that even if I was suddenly terminated, I would have evidence of the compliance issues for regulatory authorities if needed. The most strategic move, however, was my careful communication to Mr. Donovan, the chairman of the board. Rather than making accusations or complaints about Richardson, I sent a brief factual email. In preparation for the upcoming regulatory audit, I wanted to flag potential documentation gaps in our compliance oversight structure that may require board risk committee review. I have attached a summary of the regulatory requirements regarding compliance leadership qualifications and documentation. Given the auditor's stated focus on governance this year, this may be an area worth addressing proactively. It was carefully worded to fulfill my professional obligation to report potential issues while avoiding any appearance of insubordination. The attachment did not mention Bradley by name, but clearly outlined the regulatory requirements that his appointment violated. Richardson, meanwhile, remained overconfident. In compliance meetings, he and Bradley dismissed my concerns about audit preparation as excessive caution and continued to focus on ways to present the department as business-friendly rather than addressing substantive compliance requirements. The auditors just want to see that we have processes in place, Bradley declared in one meeting. They do not actually dig into the details if you manage the relationship properly. I chose not to correct this dangerous misunderstanding. The regulatory auditors were not corporate visitors to be charmed. They were experienced examiners specifically trained to look beyond surface presentations to verify actual compliance. As the audit date approached, I noticed Richardson becoming increasingly nervous, though he tried to hide it. The reality of having his unqualified son lead a critical regulatory examination was finally sinking in. Twice I caught him asking Bradley pointed questions about specific regulations, only to receive vague, confident answers that contained no actual substance. In a last-ditch effort to prepare, Richardson ordered the compliance team to work through the weekend before the audit, reviewing documentation and conducting mock interviews. I complied without complaint, using the opportunity to further document the gaps in our preparation and Bradley's lack of understanding of fundamental compliance concepts. By the time the audit was scheduled to begin the following Monday, my strategy was fully in place. I had created a comprehensive record of compliance issues, sent appropriately escalated warnings through proper channels, and positioned myself as a professional simply trying to uphold regulatory requirements. Whether this would be enough to save my job remained uncertain, but I was determined that the truth about our compliance situation would come to light one way or another. The audit was scheduled to begin Monday at 9 in the morning. I arrived at 7:30 to ensure everything was in order, only to find the reception area already buzzing with activity. To my shock, the regulatory audit team had arrived a day early, a tactic sometimes used to prevent companies from making last-minute preparations. The lead auditor, a stern woman named Margaret with 20 years of regulatory experience, was already being escorted to the conference room designated for the examination. Behind her trailed 4 additional auditors, each carrying identical black briefcases and expressionless faces. I intercepted them in the hallway, introducing myself calmly. "Good morning. I am Carmel Thompson, Senior Compliance Officer. I understand you are beginning earlier than scheduled." Margaret nodded briskly. "We had a schedule adjustment. All firms in this review cycle are being examined a day earlier than noticed. Standard procedure." "Of course," I replied smoothly. "I would be happy to help get you settled and provide the initial documentation you requested." As I led them to the conference room, my phone buzzed with frantic texts from Richardson. "Where are you auditors here? Early. Get to conference room now. Where is audit documentation?" I responded simply that I was already with the audit team handling the situation. When Richardson arrived 10 minutes later, he was visibly flustered, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. Bradley trailed behind him, looking pale and unprepared. "Margaret, welcome to Westfield Financial," Richardson said, attempting to regain his composure. "I am Thomas Richardson, VP of Regulatory Affairs, and this is Bradley Richardson, our Associate Director of Strategic Compliance Initiatives, who will be your primary contact for this examination." Margaret looked up from her papers with a raised eyebrow. "We were expecting to work primarily with Miss Thompson, based on previous communications and her role in past examinations." Richardson forced a smile. "There have been some organizational changes. Bradley will be leading our response team with Carmel, providing support as needed." The lead auditor's expression remained neutral, but I noticed her making a note on her pad. "I see. Well, Mr. Richardson, perhaps you could start by walking us through your compliance governance structure and how oversight responsibilities are allocated." Bradley stepped forward confidently. "Absolutely. Our governance structure is top-notch, really best in class. We have a very robust system of checks and balances." Margaret waited for him to continue with specifics. When none came, she prompted, "Could you elaborate on the specific oversight mechanisms, reporting lines, and how compliance issues are escalated to board level when necessary?" Bradley glanced at his father, his confidence wavering. "Well, we have regular meetings and dashboard reports and a very thorough documentation process. Perhaps you could provide the compliance committee minutes from the past quarter, along with examples of escalated issues and their resolution," Margaret requested. "I can retrieve those I offered, knowing exactly where they were stored." "Bradley can handle it," Richardson interjected. "Carmel, why do not you assist the other auditors with their initial document requests?" As I moved to help the other audit team members, I heard Bradley struggling to locate the requested documents in our electronic system. The filing system is a bit different than I am used to, he explained awkwardly. By lunchtime, the situation had deteriorated significantly. The auditors had identified multiple discrepancies in our documentation, particularly related to recent changes in risk assessments that lacked proper justification. These were exactly the changes Bradley had made without understanding their regulatory significance. Richardson called an emergency meeting of the executive team in his office, excluding me but including Bradley. Through the glass walls, I could see animated discussions and Richardson repeatedly running his hand through his hair in frustration. Jessica stopped by my desk with an update. "They are panicking in there," she whispered. The lead auditor asked Bradley to explain the methodology behind the recent risk assessment changes, and he completely blanked. Then she asked about his regulatory qualifications and experience, and Richardson had to jump in. By mid-afternoon, Mr. Donovan himself had arrived unexpectedly. The tall, distinguished chairman of the board rarely visited the operational floors, preferring to remain in the executive suite. His presence indicated the seriousness of the situation. As he strode through the office toward the conference room where the auditors were working, he stopped at my desk. "Miss Thompson," he said quietly, "I received your email about the compliance leadership qualifications. Why was I not informed of these concerns through normal reporting channels?" "I did raise them with Mr. Richardson," I replied carefully. "I was informed that the changes had been approved at the executive level." Donovan's expression darkened. "I see. The Board Risk Committee has not approved any changes to compliance leadership structure or qualifications. Would you join me with the auditors, please?" The next hour was the most tense of my professional career. In the conference room, Margaret systematically outlined numerous compliance deficiencies they had already identified, many stemming directly from Bradley's unauthorized changes and Richardson's failure to maintain proper governance. "These are serious issues," Margaret concluded, "particularly the apparent breakdown in compliance governance and the unauthorized modifications to risk assessments without documented justification. We will need to expand our examination scope significantly and potentially refer certain matters for further regulatory review." Richardson, now visibly sweating, attempted damage control. "There may have been some administrative oversights during our recent transition, but I assure you our compliance program remains robust." "Administrative oversights," Margaret repeated skeptically. "Mr. Richardson, we have identified multiple instances where high-risk items were downgraded, without analysis mandatory. Reviews were skipped and access controls were violated. These are not administrative oversights." Mr. Donovan turned to me. "Ms. Thompson, as the senior compliance officer, what is your assessment of these findings?" This was the moment of truth. Richardson glared at me, the threat in his eyes clear. Bradley looked like he might be sick. "Mr. Donovan," I began calmly, "I have documented concerns about recent changes to our compliance processes and governance." I placed a folder on the table. "This contains my analysis of the compliance issues identified along with emails and other documentation showing that these concerns were raised internally but overridden." As Donovan reviewed the documents, Richardson's face flushed with anger. "This is insubordination," he sputtered. "Carmel has been resistant to necessary changes and is trying to undermine Bradley's leadership." "Is that so?" Donovan asked coldly. "Because what I see here is evidence that you implemented organizational changes without proper approval, installed an unqualified individual in a key compliance role, and dismissed legitimate regulatory concerns raised by your senior PACA compliance officer." The meeting escalated into a boardroom emergency session with additional executives and legal counsel joining. Richardson became increasingly desperate, eventually trying to claim that I had sabotaged the compliance documentation to make Bradley look bad. My meticulous paper trail proved otherwise. Every email, every log system change, every documented warning created an undeniable timeline that supported my account and contradicted Richardson's claims. By evening, the audit had been temporarily suspended while the company addressed the governance breakdown. Mr. Donovan had sequestered himself with the general counsel and other board members to determine next steps. Richardson and Bradley were instructed to remain available, but were effectively sidelined from the process. As I gathered my things to leave that night, exhausted but vindicated, Jessica stopped by my desk. "You know what they are saying in the executive suite?" she asked with a small smile. "That tomorrow is going to be a day of reckoning." The next morning, I arrived to find the office in a state of subdued chaos. Security personnel stood near the executive suite, and rumors flew through every department. I went straight to my desk and began organizing the additional documentation the auditors would likely request once their examination resumed. At 9:30, Mr. Donovan appeared on our floor with the general counsel and the head of HR. They walked directly to Richardson's office, where he and Bradley were already waiting. The blinds were quickly drawn, but the raised voices could occasionally be heard through the glass. At 10:15, Jessica rushed to my desk, her eyes wide. "They are escorting them out. Security is walking Richardson and Bradley to the elevator right now." I remained focused on my work, refusing to gawk or appear to be celebrating their downfall. This was not about personal vindication, but professional integrity. At 11, Mr. Donovan's assistant appeared at my desk. "Miss Thompson, your presence is requested in the boardroom immediately." The boardroom was imposing with its long mahogany table and views of the Chicago skyline. Mr. Donovan sat at the head, flanked by several board members and executives I recognized but rarely interacted with. "Please sit down." Mr. Donovan gestured to an open chair. His expression was grave but not unkind. "Miss Thompson, I want to personally apologize for the situation you have endured. The board has reviewed your documentation and determined that Mr. Richardson violated numerous company policies and potentially regulatory requirements in his attempt to install his son in a compliance leadership role." I nodded, maintaining my professional demeanor. "Thank you, sir. My primary concern has always been ensuring our compliance program meets regulatory requirements." "Indeed," said Donovan. "Which brings us to the current situation. The audit team will resume their examination tomorrow, and they will expect to work with the head of compliance. That position is now vacant." He slid a folder across the table toward me. "This is a formal offer for you to assume the role of Director of Compliance effective immediately. The board has unanimously approved this appointment based on your qualifications and demonstrated commitment to regulatory integrity." I opened the folder to find an offer letter with a salary significantly higher than even what I had hoped for in my originally promised promotion. Additionally, Donovan continued, "We would like you to lead a comprehensive review of our compliance governance structure to ensure this type of situation cannot occur again. The board believes our compliance function needs greater independence and direct reporting lines to board-level committees." As I left the boardroom with my new title and mandate, I learned the full story of what had happened that morning. Mr. Donovan had arrived early for a meeting with the audit team, asking Richardson, "Where is she? Where is Carmel Thompson?" Richardson, not realizing the chairman was already aware of the situation, had responded with misplaced confidence. "I replaced her with my son. He brings a fresh perspective to compliance that we needed." Donovan had stared at him in disbelief before saying, "My God, what have you done?" It turned out that Donovan had specifically requested my involvement in the audit based on my reputation with the regulators from previous examinations. He had been completely unaware of Richardson's plan to sideline me and had never approved Bradley's appointment to any compliance role. The next few weeks were intensely busy as I worked with the audit team to address their findings while simultaneously rebuilding the compliance department with proper governance structures. I hired 2 additional experienced compliance professionals and established direct reporting lines to the board risk committee, bypassing the executive level that had allowed Richardson's nepotism to flourish. Richardson and Bradley were gone, but the damage they had done required significant remediation. Several of Bradley's unauthorized changes to risk assessments had to be reversed, and additional monitoring was implemented for affected areas. We self-reported the governance breakdown to regulators, which helped mitigate potential penalties. Throughout this period, I maintained the same professional approach that had ultimately saved my career: meticulous documentation, clear communication, and unwavering focus on regulatory requirements rather than office politics. 6 months later, with the compliance department running smoothly under my leadership, I finally took time to reflect on the experience and what it had taught me. The emotional toll had been significant, with many sleepless nights and anxiety-filled days. Healing from that took time and conscious effort. What helped most was focusing on rebuilding not just the department but my own professional confidence. Each new process implemented, each improved control, each positive feedback from regulators reinforced that I was where I belonged. The company, too, had learned valuable lessons. The board implemented new anti-nepotism policies and strengthened whistleblower protections. Executive performance reviews now included specific metrics around talent development and fair promotion practices. If you are facing a similar situation of workplace nepotism or unfair treatment, remember these key lessons from my experience. Document everything professionally and factually. Your paper trail is your strongest defense. Know your company's policies and industry regulations. Often, nepotism violates established rules that can be leveraged. Focus on the business impact, not just personal fairness. Show how the nepotism threatens company success or compliance. Build allies who can verify your version of events when needed. Maintain your professionalism even when others do not. This enhances your credibility when the truth emerges. Remember that standing up for yourself is not just about personal vindication, it is about upholding professional standards that benefit everyone. The most important lesson I learned was that true professional worth cannot be diminished by someone else's nepotism or favoritism. Expertise, integrity, and diligence may be temporarily overlooked, but in regulated industries like finance, they ultimately prove indispensable. Have you ever faced workplace nepotism or unfair treatment? How did you handle it? Share your story in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more professional insights and workplace justice stories. Remember, your career should be built on merit, not connections, and sometimes standing up for what is right is the best career move you can make. Thank you for listening, and I wish you success built on genuine expertise and integrity, not family connections.